Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of September of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the cities like Kamyanskaya, Plavny, and the city of Stepnogorsk. So I would like to point your attention exactly to this area because during the previous 2 months the Russians were over-focused in this area, and the Russian focus first of all tell us that most likely the Russians do have some plans for this direction, or the Ukrainians have concentrated significant number of forces and the Ukrainians are just waiting in order to begin offensive operations towards Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So for better understanding, of course, it's always good to increase the numbers of updates, and the numbers of updates are telling for itself. Just take a look at this picture. A lot of strikes are taking place in Stepnogorsk, significant number of attacks are taking place in Pyatikhatki, Mali Sherbaki, so we see a certain flank and a certain concentration of the armored forces of Ukraine, including the village of Primorskaya. So something big is going to happen, obviously. The same situation we used to see in the village of Prichistovka, the same situation we used to see in the Sivers direction before some additional changes on the ground. So let's follow this area. Now let's move further, and now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. Let's move there, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Russians began full-scale offensive operation towards the coal mine South Donbas number 3. We have already discussed this video during the previous let's say event, but still by the evening of the 14th of September we haven't received additional updates whether the Russians managed to establish complete control over the territory and to secure the coal mine or not, whether the Ukrainians managed to repel the Russian attacks and to restore control. For now we don't know, but obviously there are very heavy clashes because this is the vital position both for Russian and for Ukrainian sources, and who controls the South Donbas coal mine number 3 controls the entire South Donetsk direction, including the cities like Vuhledar, Vadiane, Bogoyavlenka, and Novohrodivka. So once again, this is the video that shows us how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions and how they answer the coal mine South Donbas number 3 from the southeastern direction and from the central one. We have just few additional icons in comparison with the morning video. We have the icon and the picture of the fire anomalies, and as you can see, the entire territory was 7-fire as a result of Russian artillery strikes. Bogoyavlenka is completely covered with fire, and Novohrodivka is also completely covered with fire. As for Vuhledar itself, today we start receiving some geolocations of how the Russians were after withdrawing the Ukrainian forces inside of the residential area. This video confirms that the Ukrainians still have strong control over the territory and that there are no clashes exactly for the stronghold and for the city of Vuhledar. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction. We have a lot of very interesting updates. Currently the main clashes and the heaviest clashes are taking place on the line Ukrainsk, Lyubimovka, and Zhelana Persha. And as for Zhelana Persha, today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of heavy clashes the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village and to get as close as possible to create the Novohrodivka Cauldron. Currently the distance between the edge Russian positions in Zhelana Persha and the edge Russian position, let's say in farms of the northwestern part of Krasnogorivka, is less than 6 kilometers. We don't know for sure the number of Ukrainian forces that currently are still located in the fields, but almost every single 4 days we got additional report about additional Ukrainians withdrawing their positions from the area of Novohrodivka in the southwestern direction. Of course, by the time the Russians take under control the village of Zhelana Druga, and according to information we have, there are already very heavy clashes for this territory. Most likely the Ukrainians will be able to abandon their positions closer to the villages of Zaryan and Kurakhovka. Anyway, there are very heavy clashes right now. Now let's move to the city of Ukrainsk. We have lots of very interesting updates. During the previous video we have already discussed this small video, and in this we can see right in front of our screens, we can see the moment when the Russian soldiers were storming and attacking the Ukrainian positions to the west, to the northwest of the city of of Ukrainsk, and the Russian stormtroopers that were attacking the Ukraine positions, trenches, and the fortifications. And as a result of this attack, most likely the Russians managed to establish complete control over the territory, and this is exactly the point where the Russians were attacking obviously significant progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation. We don't know for sure whether the Russians moved further in the southwestern direction and took under control the next stronghold, but obviously this line was captured. As for different mappers, pro-Russians are saying that the Russians managed to encircle the city of Ukrainsk completely and to create a cauldron. We don't know for sure the exact number of Ukrainian soldiers that are currently located in this area. Probably we are talking about 1,500 soldiers, but not more. Furthermore, as for pro-Ukrainian mappers, they show almost the same picture with just one difference. According to pro-Ukrainian mappers, Ukrainsk currently split in two parts, in two areas: the area under complete Russian control and the gray zone. So as you can see, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, there are no more territories that are under complete control by the armed forces of Ukraine on the territory of the city by the name of Ukrainsk. So which confirms that maybe tomorrow or the day after, the Russians will continue to finish the securing operation, and the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm complete control over the territory. After that, the Russians most likely will continue moving further in the southwestern direction with the purpose to take under control the strongholds between the village of Cukurna and the city of Ukrainsk. We are talking about this stronghold, and this one. And after the Russians take these strongholds under control, they will enter the village of Cukurna, which will lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in this area. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Selydove. During the previous, after the first stage of offensive operation, when, according to different sources, the Russians managed to establish control over more than 50% of Selydove, after that, the Ukrainians conducted a series of counterattacks and forced the Russians to fall back to the village of Mikhailivka. The Russians, during the previous 2 weeks finished were regrouping, and probably yesterday, the day before yesterday, the Russians finished regrouping and began the new wave of offensive operation in the western direction. And starting of today, we began adding additional territories under complete Russian control. We have added this part of Mikhailivka based on this video. In this video, we can see a number of Ukraine FPV drone attacks on the Russian positions all over the Mikhailivka and Selydove. One episode took place here. We have adjusted the map. Another episode took place here. We also adjusted the map. And the final episode took place in this side of the railways, very close to the coal mine of Karachenko. So based on this video, we have adjusted the entire Mikhailivka under Russian complete control and some part of Selydove. So there are very heavy clashes and the Russians continue moving further. I believe that during the previous 2 weeks, the Russians were improving logistics, because just 2 weeks ago, the Russians took under control Karlovka, and most likely the Russian engineers were working on the mining and clearing M30 road, and most likely 5 days ago or 4 days ago, the Russians finished the process and they improved logistic, and that allowed them to increase the pressure in the western direction. Now let's move to the village of Novohrodivka, and something interesting is happening here right now, and this something is developing obviously in Ukrainian favor. Let's talk about the southern flank, and today the Ukrainian sources reported that they abandoned their positions in Marynivka completely, because for the previous 3 weeks the Ukrainians have been caught in Cauldron, and the Ukrainians made lots of attempts to unblock the Ukrainians inside of the Cauldron. Most likely they managed to unblock them, and when the Ukrainians were unblocked, they abandoned their positions towards Selydove. So most likely during the next few days, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will confirm complete control over the village, and this control will allow the Russians to begin moving further in the southwestern direction towards the city of Selydove with additional pressure. So there are going to be like 2 waves of attack from the northeastern part and from the eastern direction. Now let's move to Novohrodivka. We continue receiving additional updates from pro-Ukrainian sources. Not that we continue receiving updates from Russian sources, but Russian sources are showing additional progress of the armed forces of Ukraine. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians published the video of how they were FPV droning the Ukrainians between the village of Novohrodivka, Zhuravka, Krutoy Yar, Krasny Yar. Lots of episodes, lots of geolocations. Some of these scenes were, let's say, geolocated and added on map. And if we summarize everything, Russian FPV FPV drone attacks took place in the southeastern part of Krasny Yar, exactly in this point. Another Russian FPV drone attack took place here, so which confirms that Ukrainians managed to dig between the city of Novohrodivka and villages of Zhuravka and Orlovka, and basically to cut logistic in this direction. So the Ukrainians obviously have some plans. And furthermore, today we got another video from the western part of Novohrodivka, and in this video we can see the Russian FPV drone attack on the Ukrainian vehicle that was heading towards the city of Novohrodivka. So if we summarize everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely during the next week, during the upcoming weekend, and probably the first part of the next week, the Ukrainians will try to conduct a counter-offensive operation with the purpose to answer the city of Novohrodivka from somewhere in the central part, basically to split the city in two, the northern part and the southern part, and then the Ukrainians will try to take under control or to restore control over the coal mines and the landfills in the northwestern part of the city. So obviously very heavy clashes are going to take place in Novohrodivka during the upcoming week, while the Russians are mainly concentrated in clashes for Kurakhova and all these agglomerations, all these cities and towns in Kurakhova agglomeration. The Ukrainians will try to counterattack in Novohrodivka with the purpose to restore control over the city. Obviously the Russians are not going to fall back. They understand that Novohrodivka is a vital checkpoint, vital stronghold for the Russians. There are lots of buildings, lots of landfills around, waste heaps, lots of constructions, fortifications. So Novohrodivka is like one big citadel, and this citadel can be used in the future as a base for further offensive operation in direction of Pokrovsk. So obviously there are going to be very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians understand why the Russians are currently busy in the Ukrainsk direction. It's the best time to counterattack in this area. So let's wait for additional updates, but obviously something interesting is going to happen. Today we got the video of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the southwestern part of Grodovka, and I'll remind you that according to different reliable mappers, this territory was captured by the Russians a long time ago, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, but we still continue receiving updates from this territory. So that's why we are keeping the area in contested zone, and maybe based on this video we will adjust the map back in Ukrainian favor. Now let's move further and let's talk about New York. We have different updates. We have the territory that was confirmed by the video that was published by the Ukrainians. In this video we can see a number of Ukrainian FPV drone attacks on the Russian forces and Russian positions in New York. Based on this video we have adjusted the map, and as for pro-Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians reported that Ukrainians left completely the industrial zone and that the Russians established complete control over the city of New York. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the Chasiv Yar direction. If you remember, during the previous few days we were talking a lot about the northern part, about the northern direction, and if you remember we were drawing some lines and arrows, and there was a situation that the Russians managed to improve their positions along Seversky Donetsk-Donbas canal, and that the Russians, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, established complete control of Grigorovka, and we were expecting and we projected that most likely the Russians are trying to encircle the Ukrainian dense network of fortifications between Grigorovka and Karlivka. We're talking about this area, and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. And today we got first geolocations that confirm our projection. In this video that was published by a 56 motorized brigade, we can see a number of FPV drone attacks on the Russian positions. Some of the episodes were geolocated, and one episode was geolocated exactly in this point, which confirms complete control over this complex network of trenches by the armed forces of Russian Federation. The Ukrainians most likely withdrew their position towards this forest, and this is probably the last island of Ukrainian positions on this side of Seversky Donetsk-Donbas canal in the vicinity of Bogdanovka, Kalinovka and Grigorovka. Obviously this is the next target of the armed forces of Russian Federation. The Russians will try to secure this territory during the next upcoming week and to force the Ukrainians to fall back on the Ukrainian side of canal, and then the Russians will do the same. They will try to cross canal Seversky Donetsk-Donbas, and then they will try to attack Chasiv Yar from the north. So most likely this is exactly what we are going going to see during, let's say, late September and early October. Now let's move further. As for Sivir, the Sivir's direction, we haven't received anything special, just a regular activity, the same story. And for the northern Kupiansk direction, just with one exception, we don't have any geolocations, but we have a lot of changes on the ground according to different mappers. The pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions in the southwestern direction from the village of Peshchane. The pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians managed to complete the opposite. They have improved their positions in the northwestern direction of the village of Peshchane. Anyway, this is the Peshchane flower, and the Peshchane flower is blooming, and the more the Peshchane flower is blooming, the more problems it brings to the armed force of Ukraine. So obviously something interesting is going to happen during the next 2 weeks. Now let's move to the village of Sinkovka. I'll remind you that exactly in this point, yesterday we discussed the video how the Ukrainians were trying to capture Russian soldier, and he used grenade and he blew up himself. And today we got additional report from pro-Ukrainian sources, and according to them, the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of Sinkovka, but not so far, so deep in direction of Petropavlovka as the yesterday's geolocation show us. So maybe this is the situation, but anyway, the Russians are moving further. Now let's talk about the Kursk direction, where the Ukrainians continue suffering significant losses. Currently, the Ukrainians still haven't managed to stabilize the situation, but they managed to slow down the Russians at least a little bit. We have adjusted the map for additional area. This is it. We are not going to, let's say, we are going to keep the territories that were captured by the Russians until the end of the Kursk counteroffensive. We are talking on this part just to show people, just to have better understanding how much the Russians managed to regain and how many territories left. So as for the geolocations, we have a lot of videos on the line between the village of Snagast and Lyubimovka. The videos were published and provided us by the Ukrainian forces, and most of these videos are showing us the Russian attempts to counterattack in direction of Lyubimovka and how many vehicles and the personal carriers the Ukrainians managed to destroy as a result of anti-tank strikes, anti-tank missile strike, and so on. So some episodes took place here. One of the episodes took place here. In this video we can see the movement of Russian BMD the second, and that this BMD was probably got on mine and was destroyed, and maybe destroyed as a result of anti-tank attack. And in this video we can see additional videos of how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian forces exactly in this point with FPV drones, with artillery and different types of weapons. Based on this video, once again, based on these episodes, we have adjusted the entire territory. Furthermore, additional details. According to information we have, currently there are very heavy clashes for the village of Darina. Furthermore, the Russians, according to unconfirmed reports, managed to establish complete control over Tolstolukh. And if we summarize everything, we see that the Russians are have already established control over everything that goes along the river of Snagas. So this is very important, this is very important because we still haven't received any report that confirms that the Russians managed to cross Snagas river. Currently, this is something like a natural barrier that Ukrainians will try to use to slow down the Russians and not to allow them. And this is the reason why the battle for the village of Lyubimovka is so important, because if the Russians are able to move through Lyubimovka, they will be able furthermore to walk to cross the river of Snagas, and to move further deep inside in direction of Sverdlikova, Lebedekova, and Sudzha itself. So this is very important village, and the Ukrainians are not counting losses because they understand if the Russians are able to go through this river, then they're going to have significant problem until they will try to hold these territories until they finish regrouping. But to regroup, the Ukrainians need to bring forces back from, let's say, the village, from the territory of Orlovka, Pogrебki. The Ukrainians need to return back forces from Ruskaya Porechnya back to Sudzha, and the Russians are not allowing to do this Ukrainians, and the Russians are bombing and attacking the Ukrainians with artillery, with aviation, trying to pin the Ukrainians down, to slow them down, to destroy the vehicles, ridiculous and the most important right now in this stage of the Russian counteroffensive to destroy as many as possible fuel trucks. So now this is the most important. Without fuel, the Ukrainians will not be able to regroup. Without fuel, the Ukrainians will not be able to bring additional force and basically even to run away from the Kursk area. So as for now, this is the priority for the Russians. Number one, to destroy as many as possible fuel trucks. Now let's talk about the southeastern part of Sudzha direction. We have another video of very heavy clashes on the territory of village by the name of Borki. We will not watch the video till the end. We will just watch a few episodes at the beginning. Currently, and according to this video, the Ukrainians were trying to repel Russian attacks, but the Ukrainians were defeated. Ukrainians suffered significant losses, and most likely the Russians are about to establish complete control over this village and to continue moving further in the direction of Plokhova, which is very important because as for this direction, the main purpose of the Russians is to get inside of the village of Guiva and then through Guiva to move towards the this part, and this is the border, let's say, checkpoint. And if the Russians are able to get there by this attack, they can create another, let's say, pressure and to create additional part of the Cauldron of the Kursk direction. As for Ukrainian attempts to stabilize the situation, for some reason the Ukrainians decided to counterattack and to attack the Russians in the direction of the village by the name of Glushko. But as I understand, it's already too late. The Ukrainians made few attempts to take under control the village. And the Ukrainian sources reported that Ukrainians managed to take under control the village of Veselye, but the geolocations are saying completely opposite. Yes, the Ukrainians did made an attempt to attack, but that attack most likely was repelled by the Russians, or the Ukrainians managed to enter very far from the borderlands and they lost supply and support roads with the mainland, and they stopped, they stretched their forces between the tree lines and the fortifications, and basically the Ukrainians began bombing Russian positions inside of the village. In this video, for example, we can see how the Ukrainians were conducting reconnaissance operation above the village of Veselye and how the Ukrainians were bombing the edge Russian defense positions, which obviously confirms that the Russians have strong control over the village itself and they haven't allowed the Ukrainians to move further in the northern direction. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.